Hello and welcome to my video. I wanted to show a very short example of the use of electional astrology. Recently, I had to do my driving test in London, and this is a circumstance where you cannot really elect your chart with astrology. So if you want to start something, you can use astrology to maximize your chances of success through the use of electional astrology in particular. But for a driving test, where you don't really have many choices for the tests, you can use electional astrology just to pick the most favorable chart rather than to fine tune everything to be according to what you need. I'm going to give an example of my first driving, an example for my first driving exam and an example for my second driving exam, which was successful. The first one was not successful. So in the first one, this is a chart with Leo rising for the 31st of March 2025. So we have Leo rising at 24 degrees of Leo with the ruler of the ascendant in Aries, that is the sun. So just a quick introduction about electional astrology. You care about a number of things, but roughly what you care about is the ruler of the ascendant. You want it to be placed well by house, by sign. If possible, it should be either exalted or in its domicile, preferably probably in its domicile, and the second favorable one is exalted, even though exaltation is a bit different, qualitatively different to domicile. So depending on what you want to do, you pick either domicile or exaltation, but they're both very strong positions. And you want to look at the aspects that the ruler of the ascendant is doing with the other planets and obviously the rulership. So in our case, for the first driving test, we have a Leo rising chart with the sun in Aries. The sun in Aries is going to be ruled by Mars. If we look at a condition of the sun, it is exalted in Aries, so it's a pretty strong position there, but it is actually just separating from a conjunction with Neptune. They're still co-present in the same sign, so Neptune would probably, it can bring a little bit of clouding of judgment. And the sun is also approaching quite tightly a sextile with Jupiter, so this is a very good sign. It's probably the first aspect that is going to make with anything at all. It will approach a sextile with Jupiter in about 3 days, but it also approaches a square with Mars, and Mars is in the 12th house in Cancer, and the sun is ruled by Mars. So you would normally not want the sun to be square Mars in a day chart. So because the sun is above the horizon, this is a day chart. It's in the middle of the day, sort of, a little bit later than the middle of the day. But you would not normally want the sun to be square Mars, because in a day chart, the most difficult planet, according to traditional astrology rules, would be Mars. And Mars in the 12th house and in Cancer is probably the most difficult, the worst position that Mars could be in, because Mars is not very strong in Cancer. So the way it manifests itself is very unnatural and very, very strange. People who have Mars in Cancer, this is not very relevant for electional astrology, but people who have Mars in Cancer can be very passive aggressive, and they don't express their anger in a direct way. They can end up hurting all the people around them, people that they care about and people that they love, because Cancer does relate to things that we love and care about, especially our family. So Mars can be hurtful to those people, but not in a direct way, because Mars cannot really be direct in water. It's sort of like firing a bullet in water. It can make a lot of damage. It can do a lot of damage, but the trajectory is not probably going to be straight. You're not going to shoot for what you want it to, and things are just going to be more awkward. So this is not a very good sign, because the sun is running into that wide square with Mars. And it's also separating from a sextile with Pluto, but I think we can ignore that. And it's in a version in all the it's in a version with all the planets in Pisces and Taurus, so we can ignore those. So the condition of the ruler of the ascendant, it is, on one hand we have a good sextile with Jupiter, on the other hand we have a bad square with Mars. So overall the condition is not ideal, but is not terrible. Other than that, we want to look at benefics and malefics by sect. That means that in a day chart, we want to get Mars out of the way and we want to get Jupiter in a strong position. In this chart, Mars is out of the way with respect to the ascendant because it's in the 12th house, and the ascendant is showing, the ascendant represents you in an electional chart. So if you want to do an election for someone, the ascendant is represented by the person you're electing for and the person who starts the action, and the descendant is the person they're working with. Or in this case, because this is a driving test, I would be the ascendant, and the descendant is actually the examiner that I'm working with during that time. So Mars is in aversion to the ascendant. That's good, but it is square the ruler of the ascendant, which is not an ideal placement. But this is just a chart that I couldn't really choose, and I didn't really think too much of the electional astrology at that time. But we'll see later why this was a horrible chart to do a driving test under. And one thing I should have done is try to delay it and find a later test, because this chart overall would almost 100% guarantee failure. So if we keep moving, the second rule for looking at the benefics and the malefics, on one hand, Mars is out of the way, which is good, and on the other hand, it is making a square with the ruler of the ascendant, which is bad. And Jupiter is at 15 degrees of Gemini, which that is a sort of sextile by sign with the ascendant, but it's a very wide angle, and the ascendant is moving away from that Jupiter actually. So Jupiter's influence is not very good, but it is offering a helpful sextile to the Sun. If we look at the condition of the moon is very strongly placed for this. This is the start of the exam, right? 3:02 p.m. The moon is very strongly placed in the 10th house, which after the first house, that is the strongest placement, and it's conjunct in the midheaven, and it's in Taurus, where the moon is exalted actually. It's a very strong position. The moon can be very effective and very good there, and the moon is considered in astrology a wanderer. I guess when you're doing a driving test, you're wandering around. If we look at aspects, though, the moon is approaching a conjunction with Uranus. Still quite a wide angle, but it's still approaching a conjunction with Uranus. It's in a sextile with Mars, which we can ignore because Mars cannot do a lot of damage in a sextile. It is somewhat squaring the ascendant. That's also something that we can ignore. It is a somewhat good relationship. Maybe the moon, it would be slightly benefic in this case by being close to a square with the ascendant. But the ascendant again is moving away from that square. And it is also making a sextile. It's actually separating from a square with Pluto, and it's about to make a sextile with Saturn and all those planets in the 8th house in Pisces. So Saturn, Venus, Mercury, and including the north node of the moon. Those aspects are somewhat good. So the moon is not in very bad condition. I think the moon is okay. Not as bad of a condition as the sun. However, because the sun is the ruler of the ascendant, and with that Mars there, we're running into some frustration. Maybe there's some good intention at the beginning, but then we're running through some frustration, right? Because of that approaching square from Mars. Moving on to the part that usually this would be the less relevant part, but in this case, because we have a driving test and the ruler of descendant is in the ninth house, which is somewhat neutral. It's a good position because you can support the ascendant from the ninth, but it does not really represent what this chart is about. So if you do pick a chart for something, you want the ruler of the ascendant to be in a house, to be well placed by sign and house, but you want its placement by house to represent to some extent what you're trying to achieve. And probably the best placement for the ruler of the ascendant would be in the third house. So if you are about to do a driving test, you probably want a well placed ruler of the ascendant in the third, indicating that you are taking a test, you're doing an exam, and it's a driving exam. Cars, driving, means of transport are all sort of falling in the third house. Because we don't have any planets there, we can still look at the third house. It is empty, but it is ruled by Venus, and we have a retrograde Venus actually in Pisces. It is at 27 degrees, so Venus is actually quite strongly placed in Pisces because it is exalted there, but it is in the eighth house. So even though it is exalted, it cannot really help the ascendant in this case, because the ascendant and Venus are almost in a 150-degree angle, which traditionally that's considered a version. So those planets, they don't really communicate well. They don't really communicate at all most of the time. So the ruler of the third house is not well placed. It's well placed by sign, which offers some mitigation. It is very close to a conjunction with Saturn. Saturn is the out of sec malefic, but Saturn is pretty much known for saying no. So in astrology, the malefics, Mars and Saturn, they usually say no. In the benefics, Venus and Jupiter, they tend to say yes to things. But if we look at the topic of driving, which is Venus, it is close but separating from a conjunction with Saturn, which would still probably indicate a no. It is in a trine with that Mars in the 12th house and in a very wide square with Jupiter. The square with Jupiter might help. But before anything, that Venus is probably going to hit Saturn. Oh, actually, because both Venus and Saturn are retrograde, they're actually going to complete that conjunction at some point. So Venus running into Saturn, that is another indication, that is another malefic being involved. We already had the Sun in a square with Mars. There's one malefic, sort of bringing frustration and maybe also denying whatever you're trying to get done here. But Venus, the ruler of the third house, which this whole chart is about, is about to make a conjunction with Saturn, which is very well known for just saying no and being a sort of party pooper. And the second planet that would represent what's going on here is Mercury. But Mercury is in the worst possible position probably in this chart that you can have it in, because it is retrograde, so its significations and the things it's trying to do, those things are kind of stopped. They're prevented from being successful during a retrograde. So when Mercury is retrograde, its ability to communicate, it kind of breaks down. And it's also in the sign of its fall. Mercury is exalted in Virgo, so because Mercury is in Pisces here, Mercury is in the sign of its fall and is not effective at all. And it's in the 8th house, so it does not have much energy to do anything. It doesn't have any mitigation. It is ruled by Jupiter, and it is approaching a very wide square, about 15 degree angle square with actually 14, with Jupiter in the 11th house. But it's still in the 8th house and it's not able to directly support either the sun or at least the ascendant. So Mercury and Venus are both sort of in the 12th house from the sun. So if you think of the sun as the first house, which sometimes we do in astrology, beside looking at houses from the ascendant, we look at houses from the sun or the moon. So if we look at the position of Mercury and Venus, which both in this chart have to do with driving, they're in the 12th house from the sun, in the 8th house from the ascendant, and they're in the 11th house from the moon, which is also relevant, but much less so than the position from the sun and the ascendant. So Mercury and Venus are actually in a pretty terrible position, in a very close conjunction with Saturn, which is known for saying no and bringing a sort of heavy, depressed, very serious mood. So this chart overall just indicates a lot of trouble. Next, I actually have a video because this is a driving test that lasted for 45 minutes, and I animated the chart over those 45 minutes so you can see how the chart is changing throughout the exam. And I'll tell you later at what point I actually failed the exam. So if we start to animate the chart, so the ascendant, the AS, and the midheaven, the MC, they're going to move the fastest. So every 4 minutes they move about 1 degree, and the test is about 45 minutes, so at least 11 degrees roughly. So let's animate the chart, right? So we see how the ascendant is moving, the midheaven is slower. And at some point, the ascendant moved into Virgo. So what's going on here? So this is towards the end of the exam, right? A really interesting fact is that right as the ascendant moved into Virgo, the ruler of the ascendant changed for that time, and it became Mercury, which is retrograde in this time the seventh whole sign house in Sagittarius. In Pisces. But it's still in a really weak position. It's still in a bad position because it's stationing retrograde. The S next to Mercury actually means a station, but because it's red, that's how this software indicates that it's stationing retrograde. And then when it's stationing to become direct, that happens with black S, with an S in black. So as soon actually as the ascendant changed signs, because I looked at the clock during the exam, I was in a junction, in an intersection, or at some crossroads, which Mercury in both in astrological magic and in astrology, Mercury is said to rule crossroads. So I was actually at a crossroads, at a junction, and for just a second or two, my mind just slipped, and I let the car go forward for a bit, and then very suddenly and out of nowhere, a car was speeding right in front of me, and obviously it was kind of a shock. So if we look at the chart towards the end, we see that the midheaven is actually approaching a conjunction with Uranus. So the midheaven is also a very important point in an electional chart. It was not among the points that I've mentioned, but it's still a really important point to look at because any planets that the midheaven is going to touch during your throughout the event that you're planning to do, if the midheaven will touch Uranus, something unexpected is going to happen. And this is exactly what happened. I was in an intersection and a car was speeding, was going really fast in front of me. So I wouldn't expect in a busy intersection for a car to move so fast. And that's why I sort of let the car go forward so I can get better visibility. But obviously that was a mistake and my mind sort of slipped for a second. I almost didn't even realize what happened. I instinctively pressed the brake and I didn't really realize what had happened for a few minutes until I realized, oh, I probably failed this exam. But then I had to continue for a couple of minutes to go back to the test center where I got the result, and this turned out to be a failure. Yeah, so the chart is very interesting, and we can see how well things are matching. It's almost like astrology works really well. things are matching really, really well with what's going on. So overall, if you went to an astrologer telling them, I'm gonna take an exam at this time. Can you tell me, the outcome of the exam? What do you think? How do you think this exam is gonna go? Can you tell me that from the chart? And yeah, obviously, you could describe events. You could describe an unexpected event, such as when the midheaven is touching Uranus. Something unexpected might happen. The moon is also applying to that Uranus. And maybe this chart would have been okay if the moon was not in Taurus next to Uranus. Maybe nothing unexpected would have happened, because with Uranus, you often need a planet to be involved. You need a planet to be in aspect with it, and especially the moon is really good at manifesting things really fast. So every time the moon goes over a certain planet, you're going to notice that it sort of magnifies in the moment the significations of that planet. So you might have, when the moon moves into Gemini, for example, in this chart, maybe you're going to have a really meaningful conversation with somebody who's very benevolent, right? Jupiter represents people who are benevolent, who say yes, who are supportive, and very generous with words. This is a Jupiter in exile in Gemini. It might be very generous with words. It might talk maybe a little bit too much. It might expand the conversation for far longer than you expected. But the moon being with Jupiter there, it's a very good combination. When the moon is going to go into Cancer and it's going to conjoin that Mars, maybe a lot of frustration is going to come, or there's going to be a lot of frustration, maybe not outwardly expressed, but under is going to be something that's sort of beneath the surface. Yeah, I think we can move to the next chart. So this is the second driving test. So we're going to look at exactly the same rules, right? The ruler of the ascendant and its condition, the benefics and the malefics, the condition of the moon, the other relevant planets. So this was the next available test that I could book. So for this one, I actually paid more attention to the chart. For the first one, I did see the red flags, and I was still hoping that in spite of all those things saying no, I was still hoping maybe I'm gonna pass somehow, because there's no way to get another test anytime soon. I'm gonna have to do it. So I decided to go ahead anyway, but I shouldn't have if I wanted to be successful right from the beginning. But a couple of months later, I got this other time, so of 3:19 p.m. So on the 1st of October 2025 at 3:19 p.m., I started the second driving test. This is a chart with Saturn as ruler of the ascendant. So the ascendant is at 12 degrees of Capricorn when the test was supposed to begin. I think it began maybe 2-3 minutes later. The ruler of the ascendant is Saturn in the third house. It is retrograde in Pisces, which is normally you don't want the ruler of the ascendant to be retrograde, but because it's Saturn and it's a much slower planet anyway, it's relatively fine. But still, because it's retrograde, its significations and its power is somewhat diminished and blocked and delayed. It can be. But at least by house, it's placed quite well. So Saturn doesn't have a lot of dignity in Pisces. So Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, and the first decan of Pisces maybe is ruled by Saturn in I think by one method of coming up with the rulers of the decans of the signs in astrology. Saturn has some dignity in the first decan of Pisces, and by bounds, if you do look at bounds, Saturn was very close to 28 degrees of Pisces. So from 28 to 30 degrees of Pisces, which 30 degrees of Pisces is actually 0 degrees of Aries, but from in those last 2 degrees of Pisces, Saturn would have some dignity supposedly. I don't really use bounds, but I still add them to charts to look at them just in case. They're somewhere in the back of my mind when I'm trying to interpret a chart, but I don't really look at bounds too much. But I do look at rulership, I do look at exaltation, I look at deacons sometimes, and as much more rarely at triplicity lords. And Saturn doesn't really have, because water is more of a feminine element, it's more of a passive element or a yin, as opposed to yang, such as fire. Fire is a yang element, right? The moon. The water is more yin. And Saturn is a day planet, and it doesn't have triplicity. It doesn't have a lot of dignity in Pisces, but it's not really terrible in Pisces. So it's just a sign, as opposed to Aries, where Saturn is fallen, right? So Saturn being in the third house in Pisces in retrograde is not too bad. If we look at aspects, actually it is supporting that moon at 27 degrees in Capricorn, which is really good because the position and the condition of the moon is also something that we care about. And because we have a sextile between the moon and Saturn, that is really good because the moon has reception from Saturn, because the moon is ruled by that Saturn in the third house. So that's a pretty good position, even though Saturn is a malefic, but this is a day chart, so it can show difficulties that you can overcome. It is also making an out of sign sextile with Uranus, but I think for the purpose of these videos, maybe we can ignore this. And Saturn is also in a somewhat close conjunction with Neptune. Both of them are retrograde, but Saturn is faster, so it will separate from that conjunction with Neptune. It's going away from it, it's going to station, and then it's going to go ahead, and much later it's going to actually complete the conjunction. So that's an influence that's sort of dwindling. The power of it, the energy of it is kind of dwindling. Another really nice aspect that Saturn is making is a trine with Jupiter, and Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Jupiter is very strong. It's placed on the descendant. So, like I said earlier, the descendant in this case, most symbolically, the descendant is going to be representative for the person that I'm doing the exam with, the examiner, right? And Jupiter in Pisces is somebody who's quite benevolent. And I had actually, I did this exam with a very nice lady. She was very kind throughout the exam, and very calm. So Saturn has a very strong trine from Jupiter in Cancer. It is also bona fide. So in traditional astrology and Hellenistic astrology, if Jupiter is making a trine within 3 degrees, especially with a planet, we say that planet is bona fide, which is a very auspicious position. In this case, it's a bit more than 3 degrees. That's why there's no blue line between Jupiter and Saturn. It's more than 3 degrees, but it is still a pretty close trine. I configured my software to only show aspect lines when we have a very strong aspect, so within 3 or 4 degrees. And in this case, because Saturn rules the ascendant is represented by me. The ascendant, Saturn and Jupiter in the 7th house, they're all sort of communicating very well, and Jupiter is affirming things. So even if Saturn is trying to say no because of that very strong Jupiter and the trine, it is much more likely to say yes. It is in aversion to Mars in Scorpio. So Mars is also very strong. It's in Scorpio, The midheaven is separating from it, which is good because we we avoided that heightened Mars energy. Um, and also, I don't remember if I mentioned, but Saturn also has a reception from Jupiter because Saturn is ruled by that Jupiter in the seventh house. Um, Also, the moon in the first house is making an opposition with Jupiter, which again, in Hellenistic astrology, an opposition from Jupiter. We're not too sure about this rule, but if it's within 3 degrees, it's usually considered a very good aspect, even though it's an opposition, which is of the nature of Saturn and sometimes can bring tension, but it is a tension that probably can be solved quite easily because the influence of both planets are trying to sort of do good. And Jupiter has reception from the moon. Um, it's really interesting because the moon has reception from Saturn. Saturn has reception from Jupiter. Jupiter has reception from the moon. So they form a very nice cyclical relationship in the chart. So they're very, very nicely placed. So this chart looks already a lot better, right? We looked at the ruler of the ascendant. We looked at benefics. So the benefic that we care about, because this is a day chart again, is Jupiter. It's in a very good position. The malefic that we care about will be Mars, because that's the most difficult in a day chart. And Mars doesn't make any tied aspect with anybody else. The moon is approaching by sign. The moon is in a sextile relationship with Mars, so that's okay, even though it is approaching a square with it when it's gonna pass into Aquarius the next day. But for this chart, that's fine. And the relationship between Jupiter and Mars is also, there's also a trine in there, even though it's very, very wide, but they will complete within a couple of weeks that Mars is going to reach 20 something degrees of Cancer, which will be a perfect trine with Jupiter, which means that Mars being in Scorpio is quite good. Mars is very strong in Scorpio, especially by night, but even in a day chart, it's mitigated. It's not as problematic, maybe. Or if it is problematic, it can be very efficiently problematic in a sign that it rules. But it's not too problematic thanks to the trine from Jupiter. We looked at the condition of the moon as well. We said that it is in opposition with Jupiter, which is very close to a classical like bonification condition. And other relevant planets, well, in this case, if we look at the third house, luckily we have the ruler of the ascendant in the third house, and we have the ruler of the third house being Jupiter in Cancer. It's exalted very, very strong in there. And the other planet that we would care about would be Mercury, right? So in an electional chart, the 10th house can represent the things that you're trying to achieve. So what you're shooting for. So, Mercury being in the 10th symbolically sounds pretty good, but what's even better is that square from Jupiter in Cancer, because they're both at 22 degrees and Mercury is actually approaching a very, very tight square with Jupiter. And if we animate the chart, we can see that the midheaven is moving away from Saturn and the ascendant is approaching that opposition between the moon and Jupiter, which is quite benefic. The ascendant does not change signs, and towards the end of the test, the descendant is even closer to Jupiter. So the benevolence and its ability to say yes is emphasized even more by the fact that Jupiter is setting around the time this exam takes place. So overall, this chart is a lot better. And even though I've been doing astrology for many, many years, sometimes I still look at a chart, I see the red flags, and sometimes I still go ahead with whatever I have planned because I am thinking I can't really change very much right now, so I'm gonna have to do things as they are. But I think it would have been a much better idea if I listened to what the chart was telling me for the first exam, and I would have canceled or delayed the tests for another date. Even though you can't always choose the right chart for something you want to do. In this case, the only reason I would have delayed the exam is because doing an exam can be quite expensive. So you would save you some money. You, maybe a couple $100. You save you some money if you would change the date in this circumstance. Sometimes you can't really choose or fine tune a chart to be exactly perfect, so you have to pick the sometimes the worst of two evils. But it's good to pick something that maximizes your chances of success. And obviously, in this case, the second chart is so much better than the first one. That's all. Thank you so much.